Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the History Cloak channel. I'm Mr. McGee. Now, on today's episode and subsequent episodes, we are going to focus on the U.S. government. Now, the U.S. government has been in the news recently, and by recently I mean since the first Tuesday in November. Since the government has been the talk of the town, I thought that this would be the best time to take a look at how the U.S. government is built. We'll look at different parts of the U.S. government and see how they work. If we understand how a particular thing is designed, in other words, what is its purpose? Why was it built a certain way? Then when we look at how the thing works, we can actually analyze, is the thing working well? In order to do that, we must understand its design. That is the purpose of today's episode. We're going to look at the design of the U.S. government. We're going to think about why was it built the way it was built. That way, in future episodes, when we look at how the government works, we can actually analyze, is it working well or not? So ladies and gentlemen, let's begin. If we're going to take a look at the design of the U.S. government, we need to go back to the Constitutional Convention. The Constitutional Convention took place in Philadelphia from May through September of 1787. The goal, of course, was to replace the disastrous Articles of Confederation and to create a new document that would be the foundation for the U.S. government and how the government would work and all of the different rights and so on. Now, if you're asking yourself, hey, wait a second, why are we going to the Constitutional Convention? Well, everything you know about the government, the presidency of the United States, for instance, or the House and the Senate, or the Supreme Court, all of that is found in the Constitution. The Constitution is the foundation of the government in the United States. It's important for us to recognize that, and it's also important to recognize what was the mindset of the framers of the Constitution. In other words, what was the mindset of the Founding Fathers? Everyone kind of forgets that after the Constitution was passed at the convention, it still had to be ratified by the states. In other words, the states had to vote on it. The states, having come off of the American Revolution 4 years earlier, were in no hurry to link themselves to a constitution that might end up with an all-powerful king or an all-powerful president, think dictator in their minds, that would end up controlling their entire lives, and then everything that they fought for would have been for nothing. There were debates in each state about whether or not to ratify, meaning pass, this constitution that came out of the convention. Now you may be asking yourselves, okay, how does this connect to the government? Well, 3 of our founding fathers, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, wrote a series of 85 essays, which we call the Federalist Papers today. The Federalist Papers, those 85 essays, were arguments for why the United States needed to be one whole country instead of 13 separate countries that kind of work together, meaning the 13 states. Now, I'm going to pick out one of these essays because it's very important for us to understand what is the mindset of the framers of the Constitution. I'm going to focus on Federalist Paper number 51 because that goes into the why do we have a government? Why is it important to have a government? So, in Federalist number 51, we don't know if James Madison or Alexander Hamilton wrote it. One of those guys wrote the following excerpt. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. Now, if we were to translate that, what Hamilton or Madison is saying is this. Human beings are capable of all sorts of evil. I mean, think about it. All human beings have the capacity to sin. Well, since human beings can sin, every society needs a government that can actually enforce law and protect human beings from each other. Now, there's a problem. If human beings are capable of all sorts of sin and evil, well, who's running the government? Human beings. So how do you get the government to actually control itself? In other words, you're going to have to create a government that is effective in governing the people, but you also have to design the government in a way to keep the people in the government from building power for themselves. You need a way to actually protect the people from the government. Well, to that end, we have two things that were basically created in the Constitution. We have a thing called the separation of powers, and then we have checks and balances. Now, those are broad categories, but they're important for us in terms of understanding our government. So let's start with number one, separation of powers. The United States government is broken into three distinct branches of government. You have number one, the legislative branch, number two, the executive branch, and number three, the judicial branch. Now, the legislative branch's job is to make the laws. Our legislature is made up of two houses, the House of Representatives, which we've talked about in the Electoral College episode. The House of Representatives is based on population, and we have also the Senate. The Senate is based on an equal number of representatives. Every state gets 2 senators. Our legislature is important because no bill that's a proposed law can actually become a law unless it is passed or voted on by both houses of Congress. Now, if that bill is voted on by both houses of Congress, it then moves on to the President of the United States, who can either sign the bill into law or veto it. We'll get into that a little bit later. Really, what I want to talk about is the fact that it goes to the President of the United States. The President of the United States is the head of the executive branch, our number 2 branch of government. The executive branch's job is to enforce the laws. So, the legislative branch passes the laws, the executive branch enforces the laws. We're starting to see a separation of powers. The president in the executive branch cannot create law. The legislative branch cannot enforce law. So they need each other. There's only so much power the legislative branch has, there's only so much power the executive branch has. Now, we also have a third branch, which is called the judicial branch. The judicial branch's job is to judge the laws or interpret the laws. So if there's a challenge to a particular law, it goes through the federal court system. Now, a lot of people think that the judicial branch is just the Supreme Court. Well, the Supreme Court is the most powerful court in the United States, but the federal court system actually has 3 levels to it. You have the U.S. District Court level, that's followed then by the U.S. Court of Appeals level, and then after that, the Supreme Court. Not all cases are heard by the Supreme Court. Only the judicial branch has the power to judge or interpret the laws. So do you see where the separation of powers comes in? You have a certain section of the government that can make the laws, a certain section of the government that can enforce the laws, and then another branch of government that can interpret or judge the laws. The goal of the framers of the Constitution was to keep there from being too much power accrued in one branch. In other words, all 3 branches need each other. They only have so much power, and that keeps a dictator from being able to easily arise and take over the U.S. government. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying, well, hey, if you have separation of powers, then nothing bad can happen in government. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, it's very difficult to accrue power or be able to take over the United States because you have 3 co-equal branches that are separated. And so you can only run one of those branches. There's no way to run 2 out of 3 of the branches or all 3 of the branches. That is what keeps the government governed, in a sense. Now, the other thing that comes out of the Constitutional Convention is checks and balances. Now, if you're thinking checks and balances, well, think of a check as in a stop, something that stops you from moving forward. Think of it like Ohio State checking Notre Dame's dreams of winning a national championship. Sorry, Notre Dame fans. And balance, meaning that no one branch of government has more power than the other branches. So checks and balances means that each branch has certain powers over the other 2 branches. There is no one supreme branch that controls the other 2. All branches of government have some powers over the other 2 branches, and in some ways they are subservient to the other branches. Now, there are way too many checks and balances for me to go over here, but I will leave a link in the description box so that you can read about all the different checks and balances in the U.S. government. I will give you an example for each branch of government. The executive branch, which is run by the president, the executive branch chooses the judges. The president nominates the judges that sits on the courts. The president also has veto power over any law that is passed in the legislature. So, as stated earlier, the legislature can pass a bill through both houses of Congress, and it goes to the president. But if the president vetoes the law, well then, it is not a law. It can only become a law if he signs it. Now, the legislative branch has powers over the executive branch in the fact that they can override a president's veto with a 2/3 majority in each house of Congress. Also, remember how I said the president nominates judges? Well, those judges can only sit on the court if they are voted on and passed by the legislative branch. So there is an example of the legislative branch checking and balancing the power of the executive branch. Now, the judicial branch has the power to interpret laws. They can strike down any law that is passed by Congress and signed by the president if it's challenged in the courts. They have the power to actually strike that law down. This power to overturn laws gives the people a chance to challenge laws. It also gives the states a chance to challenge laws as well. So the people still have an avenue if they believe that a law is unconstitutional. So that is the judicial branch's check over the legislative branch and the executive branch. Again, I want us to remember what was the goal of having a separation of powers and checks and balances in our government. The goal was to make it hard for any human being, remember, human beings are capable of sin and evil, any human being in the government, whether they be in the legislative branch, the executive branch, or the judicial branch, to be able to rise to power and basically take over the United States. So, now that we understand the why and the design of the government, now we can actually take a look at the function in later episodes. So I hope you can see why the design and the reason behind the design of the government is so important. Separation of powers separates the government into 3 sections so that one person can only operate in a particular section and they don't have power in the other 2. Checks and balances allows each section of government to be able to have power over the other 2 branches, so they end up being co-equal branches. I hope this video allows you to be able to look at the news and see how the different branches of government operate and why they're designed the way that they are. You'll see in the news the president and the executive branch. You will see the new Congress that is in session. You will also see during the summer the Supreme Court release their rulings, and you'll also hear rulings from the lower level federal courts as well. And I hope that you see how all 3 of these branches interact with each other and how the government affects the United States. Hopefully it gives you an appreciation for what men generations earlier built and created that we enjoy today. It's always good to remember history and remember that we truly do stand on the shoulders of giants. The stuff that we're used to that we take for granted, someone had to actually think and create those systems back in 1787 in Philadelphia. So, spare a thought for the men that came before us that started this country and tip your hats to them, because without their creation and design for the government, we may not have the country that we have today. So, as per the usual, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them respectfully and politely in the comments section below. I'm Mr. McGee. Take care.